"Get down! We're surrounded!" The scream thundered through the Sierra Nevada canyon. Bullets ripped through the air, grenades exploded, and the SEAL team was thrown into a living nightmare. In the chaos, a small woman knelt beside a wounded soldier, her trembling hands smeared with blood. She was only a medic, or at least, that was all they believed. But when her medical bag was blasted away, she rose to her feet, her eyes blazing, and in the span of a few seconds, she transformed completely. The SEALs never imagined that moment would be the one to save their lives. Isabella Torres never imagined she would become the center of attention in a SEAL unit. She joined the military with one simple goal: to save lives. Not to carry a rifle, not to flaunt her skills, and certainly not to compete for respect among men who believed that strength could only be measured by muscle and firepower. On her very first day at Coronado Base in California, the eyes of the SEALs swept over Isabella as if she were a misplaced package. Her small frame, her dark hair tied neatly back, her gentle face that looked more like a freshman nursing student than a soldier. To their eyes, that image didn't belong in the harsh landscape of the compound where broad-shouldered men jumped from aircraft, scaled walls, and swam through icy midnight seas. Whispers spread quickly. "She's so tiny, how's she supposed to carry anyone? And that medical pack nearly 40 pounds, she'll be the one lagging behind." Chuckles broke out. To them, Isabella's presence felt like a prank from command, a test of the SEAL's patience. She heard it all, yet never reacted. No need to answer back. A faint smile passed across her face, as if she had long grown accustomed to being underestimated. On the long marches, Isabella's figure hardly drew attention. Her back bent beneath the weight of the medic bag, her steps steady but slow, always trailing at the rear. Her silhouette seemed swallowed up behind the wide backs and gleaming rifles of her teammates. If there had been a photograph of the whole unit, you would have had to zoom in to the far edge just to spot Isabella, a faint blur in the background. Yet there were small details no one noticed. When a pack strap came loose and slipped to the ground, Isabella was the one to swiftly pick it up. When a bootlace came undone mid-march, she crouched, tied it neatly in a few quick motions, then returned to her place without a word. Sometimes she quietly checked her comrades' magazines, making sure no one carried an empty one by mistake. Little gestures nearly invisible to the others, but born of a single instinct, the instinct to safeguard every life. The irony was that many soldiers didn't even remember her name. "That medic," they said, and perhaps it was understandable. In a world where leaping from helicopters and enduring drowning drills were badges of honor, a slight girl carrying a bag of bandages hardly seemed worth remembering. Yet in Isabella's eyes there was something none of them cared to see: a quiet resilience. Those eyes never wavered, whether under the burning Nevada sun or the icy winds that lashed the Pacific coast. They held a resolve difficult to define, as though the weight on her shoulders was not just the medic's bag, but also a silent vow. Once, during a short break, a burly soldier threw out a joke. "Torres, you must have taken the wrong door into the military. The hospital entrance in San Diego is just a few blocks away." The group roared with laughter. Isabella simply lifted her head, took a sip from her canteen, and replied evenly, "Maybe, but it's a good thing you're not injured today. Otherwise that wrong door might have been the right one." Her calm retort brought louder laughter, even a few whistles. But in the silence that followed, one or two paused, as though something about her composure unsettled them. In her tone was a strange kind of certainty, the kind that doesn't beg to be proven. Still, most held to their opinion. She was nothing but a shadow at the back of the line. Harmless, but useless. A shadow no one expected would ever step into the light. None of them could have imagined that the name Isabella Torres, the small woman they dismissed so easily, would one day echo across the ranks of the United States military. The armored vehicle jolted to a stop on a dirt trail coated in red dust. The air grew still, broken only by the low growl of the engine before it sputtered out. The SEAL team quickly spread out, scanning the surroundings, while a few soldiers took the chance to sit down, tearing at protein bars or pouring water into canteen lids to use as cups. The atmosphere seemed calm, almost leisurely, yet everyone knew this place could become an ambush site at any moment. In that fleeting pause, the gaze of a young sergeant happened to fall toward the corner of the vehicle. Isabella Torres sat leaning against the wall, a small notebook resting on her knee. Her hand moved swiftly, each stroke of the pen firm and precise, nothing like idle doodles to pass the time. Curious, he stepped closer, and in that brief instant he saw it clearly on the page, intersecting lines, small markings, angles, distances, all forming a compact tactical sketch as clean and sharp as a sniper's map. His heart skipped. Those could not be random scribbles. They were too exact, too familiar to anyone who had ever studied battlefield tactics. A medic, sitting there calculating firing solutions during a break? Isabella sensed his eyes, quietly closing the notebook. A faint smile curved her lips, as though she had just been caught writing a love letter. "When I'm waiting, I doodle," she said calmly, as if it meant nothing at all. The sergeant said nothing more, but unease flickered in his chest. The strokes didn't look like the curious scrawl of an amateur. They bore the weight of experience, the kind only earned from hours behind a scope or long nights in grueling tactical courses. He turned away in silence, telling himself he might be overthinking. Yet the image of that notebook clung to his mind, like a hairline crack in the seemingly ordinary shell that was Isabella. Meanwhile, Isabella remained where she was, fingertips brushing the worn cover, her eyes distant. No one knew that beyond those grids and tactical notes lay dense medical records, methods for stemming arterial bleeding, the survival window after shrapnel wounds, formulas for calculating morphine dosages for a 200-pound soldier. She called it the book of things that must never be forgotten. To others, it looked like a sniper's chart. In truth, it was part battlefield journal, part survival manual, part burden of memory she had never shared. A few other teammates caught a glimpse and laughed, the medics just working on Sudoku squares, keeping her brain busy. Their laughter broke out, whistles echoing. Isabella didn't respond, only smiled lightly, as if to go along with the joke. None of them knew that beneath that smile lived a story no one was ready to hear. That moment, the silent contradiction began to grow. To the team, Isabella was only a small medic, a shadow at the rear. But anyone observant enough might notice the odd fragments slipping through. Her stride never faltered, her eyes swept the horizon like a scout's instinct, and now a notebook marked with tactical codes. The fragile shell of the fragile healer had begun to crack, though only in the thinnest line. Yet sometimes from a single fracture, the light of a greater truth can seep through. Isabella knew she was being watched, but she didn't care. She hadn't come to impress anyone, nor did she need their approval. For her, the only thing that mattered was being ready for the worst, because she knew the battlefield never showed mercy. Others might dismiss her as a joke, but when the day of reckoning came, that little notebook and its words might be the reason someone survived. A brief silence lingered, then the engines roared back to life. The convoy rolled forward again, leaving behind a cloud of red dust. The young sergeant cast one last glance at Isabella, trying to push away the questions rising in his mind. Yet deep down, he knew he had just witnessed something far from ordinary. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. Gunfire erupted like a storm crashing down from the sky. The earth shook beneath their feet, columns of dust and smoke rose like giant arms reaching to swallow the convoy whole. Bullets screamed through the air, slicing past just inches above their heads. The canyon walls on both sides threw the chaos back in deafening echoes, turning Dusty Creek into a massive iron chamber filled with explosions. The SEAL team spread out instantly, rifles raised, answering with sharp bursts of fire, but the enemy was too many, and had chosen the perfect terrain to tighten the noose. Amidst the pandemonium, Isabella's presence stood in stark contrast. No screaming, no panic, she simply crouched low, dragging the wounded out of the kill zone, her hands drenched in blood, yet her rhythm strangely calm. When a wound poured dark red, she pressed gauze firmly, wrapping it with quick, efficient movements, as if she were performing surgery in an operating room, not kneeling in the middle of hell. A young soldier, panicked, shouted in her face, "Fall back! This is combat, not your place." His voice carried more fear than command. Isabella didn't answer. Her small shoulders stayed bent over, her fingers pulling tight on the bandage, sealing the last knot that held her comrade's life together. A seasoned corporal, a man who had seen countless rookies break under fire, found himself pausing for a few seconds. To his eyes, her composure defied logic. A normal medic would tremble, scramble for cover, or cry out for help. But Isabella, under a rain of bullets, appeared calmer than the veterans themselves. Gunfire roared again in unrelenting waves. A supply truck went up in flames, fire blazing bright enough to light the valley. Thick black smoke choked the air, clouding vision. The enemy poured down the ridges, their silhouettes shifting through the haze. The SEALs poured fire back, their rifles rattling so hard it was impossible to tell which sound belonged to the living and which echoed death. Through it all, Isabella darted back and forth like a needle stitching shattered pieces together. With one glance, she could triage heavy wounds first, then the rest pressing gauze, injecting morphine, dragging bodies behind cover. Every move shaved seconds from the chaos, every action as precise as though she had done it hundreds of times before. At one point, while checking the shredded arm of a soldier struck by shrapnel, a bullet hissed past, spraying dirt at her side. The soldier yanked her down, but Isabella only smirked, stitching quickly with her kit. "Relax, you've still got the other arm to shoot with," she quipped. The soldier gave a strained laugh, even as the blood flowed on. It was a bitter smile, but that touch of humor eased the fear in a moment where death hovered too close. The way Isabella laughed in the face of gunfire left more than a few stunned. There was something different in that serenity. When a man collapsed with a gut wound, his shirt soaked red, Isabella pressed gauze hard against it, then signaled two stronger men to haul him behind a rock. To her teammates, her small figure suddenly looked unshakably solid, as if she were the anchor holding them in the storm. A sergeant, bleeding from a shoulder wound, watched carefully. He noticed her every movement was deliberate. She never dashed recklessly, never hunched too long in the open. Each time she crossed a gap, she waited for the pause in enemy fire, then slid across with swift precision. Those footsteps too exact to be mere survival instinct. The smoke thickened, explosions roared, yet Isabella seemed to be everywhere. One moment binding an arm, the next splinting a leg. Her hands flew, her focus so intense the screams and gunfire around her barely existed. At one point, a spray of blood splattered across her face. She simply wiped it away with the back of her hand and carried on, calm as though this had been her reality for years. Within the team, an unusual silence began to spread. No one spoke it aloud, but every pair of eyes tracked Isabella's shadow moving through the chaos. The woman they had dismissed as dead weight was now the only one steady in the storm. But the questions forming in their minds had no chance to surface. A fresh wave of heavy fire tore into them. Rock and dust burst apart. Men threw themselves flat. In an instant, a radio was destroyed, their only lifeline to command cut off. The commander's voice, hoarse and grim, broke through. "We're on our own." Isabella lifted her head from a wound she was still stitching, her eyes flashing with resolve. Through the smoke, the firelight cast her face in stark relief, and for the first time something unspoken, something no one yet had a name for, shone in her expression. The blast of the grenade thundered like a crack of lightning tearing the sky apart. Earth and stone erupted, smoke and dust coiled in the air, and the heavy medical bag Isabella had clung to since the first shot was hurled away. Her eyes followed it for a fleeting moment, her heart tightening. That bag was the only thing tied to the reason she had enlisted, to save lives, not to take them. But in that same instant, her gaze fell upon something else. A fallen M40 sniper rifle, lying on the dusty ground just a few steps away. The cold steel glinted through the haze, stirring a memory buried deep. Suddenly the world slowed. Gunfire, screams, even the drip of blood seemed to fade, leaving only the thunder of her heartbeat. Isabella didn't think. The hands that had always been trained to tighten bandages now reached out, gripping the rifle's stock. Her small frame trembled for a second, then steadied, as if it had found its long-lost rhythm. She raised the M40 to her shoulder, her stance so precise that the entire SEAL team froze. 1, 2, 3. 3 shots cracked through the thick smoke. 3 enemies dropped instantly, collapsing like marionettes with their strings cut. For a moment, the SEAL's own gunfire faltered, as if every man had forgotten they were still surrounded. All eyes locked on Isabella. The woman they had mocked as a burden, dismissed for her fragile appearance, now stood amid the storm of bullets with the bearing of a born marksman. Her stance, her breathing, the way she mastered the weapon perfect, almost unnervingly so. The SEAL commander, his face blackened with soot, glared at her. His voice rasped, half astonishment, half challenge. That wasn't luck. Who the hell are you, Torres? Isabella didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed through the scope, her gaze so sharp no one dared interrupt. She squeezed the trigger again, 1 shot, clean and decisive, taking down a machine gunner who had just appeared on the ridge. In seconds, the balance of the ambush shifted. A young corporal gasped soundlessly, as if witnessing an illusion. A veteran muttered a curse, not out of anger but from sheer disbelief. One thought hammered in all their minds. How could a medic shoot like that? Through the relentless rain of bullets, Isabella moved with eerie composure. She slid behind rocks, shifted angles, changed positions again and again, like someone who had done this 100 times. Her small frame was no longer an easy target. It had become a shadow, elusive and dangerous, weaving through treacherous terrain. Once, as a round hissed past her ear, she clenched her jaw, suppressing the gasp that rose in her chest. To her comrades, it looked like cold reflex. But inside Isabella, a flood of memory crashed back. The familiar weight of the stock pressed against her shoulder, the breath sinking with the squeeze of the trigger. It was like a door reopening into a past she had sworn to bury. The days she longed to forget now surged back, heartbeat by heartbeat. Nearby, as he slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, a young soldier whispered to the man beside him, "She's not a medic. No way." The other answered low, almost in awe, "If that's true, then who is she really?" The SEALs rallied, their gunfire steadying once more. But they knew deep down that it wasn't their firepower turning the tide. It was her. Isabella was no longer just patching wounds, she was commanding with every shot, carving a path through the encirclement. And in one fleeting moment, under the storm of bullets, a thought brushed the minds of many. Without her, would any of them have survived even a few more minutes? The smoke had yet to clear, but doubt already smoldered in their eyes. None dared voice it aloud, but each man felt the same truth: Isabella Torres was far more than she seemed. Gunfire still thundered across the valley, but in the moment Isabella pushed her sleeve up to tighten a bandage for a wounded soldier, every gaze seemed to converge on a single detail. On her left wrist, beneath calloused skin and sweat, a faded tattoo emerged. A coiled kraken, fierce eyes glaring, tentacles stretching outward as if to devour everything in their path. No explanation was needed. That symbol alone was enough to thicken the air. A veteran froze instantly, his lips trembling, but he could only whisper two words: "No way." In the minds of hardened soldiers, memories came rushing back. The Kraken insignia was not for just anyone. It belonged to a ghost unit, an elite sniper force that once operated in secrecy across the Middle East, where impossible records were carved into legend. There, one name had been whispered among military circles: the Mojave Ghost, a marksman who could eliminate a target at over 3,000 meters, then vanish as if he had never existed. Those stories had always been considered myth, tales told to fire up the pride of young recruits. But now, with that tattoo revealed on the wrist of a small, quiet medic, everything suddenly became frighteningly real. Isabella said nothing. Her hands kept working, her eyes fixed on the wound. Her fingers slid the bandage tight, loop after loop, as if the heavy stairs around her simply didn't exist. But inside, her past throbbed like a scar that had never healed. She had once been among the finest snipers, trained to see the world through a scope, to count each breath and fire at the precise moment. But talent came with a burden. One failed mission, one moment's hesitation, and her comrades had fallen before her eyes. From that day on, the rifle felt like stone, and the sight picture cut into her conscience like a blade. Isabella chose to walk away. She left the shadows, put on the medic's coat, and swore to herself that from then on she would only save lives. Never again take one. The Kraken tattoo should have been erased, yet she kept it not as a badge of pride, but as a reminder of the blood once soaked into her hands. Amid the screaming and fire today, that past was suddenly stripped bare, and the looks from her teammates changed, from contempt to doubt, then slowly into awe and a quiet fear. An old sergeant drew in a sharp breath, muttering under it, "If that really is the Mojave Ghost, then we've been fighting alongside a legend without even knowing it." The younger soldiers looked stunned, eyes darting at each other in disbelief. The woman they had called a burden, mocked for her small frame, turned out to be the very name they thought only lived in legend. Isabella remained silent. Her eyes lowered slightly, neither proud nor defensive. If anything shone there, it was only a quiet sorrow, a memory that could never be mended. In the blazing battlefield, the truth cut through like a blade, and the SEAL team seemed to understand all at once. No one could ever dismiss her as the shadow in the rear again. There was a fleeting moment when Isabella paused, looking up at the smoke-choked sky. On her blood and dust-streaked face, her dark brown eyes glimmered with exhaustion deep to the bone. Part of her wanted to throw the rifle away, to return to her medic's bag. But the old instincts, forged through years of discipline, urged her fingers to keep pressing the trigger. A bullet streaked past close by. Isabella leaned aside and fired reflexively. The shot was clean, so perfect, that a young soldier let out a low whistle before swearing at himself for cheering in the middle of battle. The brief humor cracked the tension, pulling a few strained smiles from the team, a fragile release from the overwhelming shock pressing on them. Deep inside, Isabella knew that every shot pulled her further from the vow she had once made to heal only, never to kill. But today, in this circle of death, the only way to keep her team alive was to let the old self awaken. And once the Kraken had risen from the depths, it would not so easily return to the dark. The fire still raged, smoke wrapped the sky, but amid the chaos, Isabella Torres stood out like an anchor. Her short, sharp commands rang clearer than the gunfire, not because she shouted louder, but because the certainty in every word forced everyone to listen. She pointed, gestured, arranged small groups to cover, reload, and provide support. Each decision was exact, saving precious seconds of survival. The woman once branded as a burden now stood in the eye of the storm like a true commander. Even the lieutenant who had led them from the start quietly followed her lead, no longer daring to interrupt. He knew, in the grip of fire and smoke, The force holding the team together was not rank, it was her undeniable presence. The eyes that had once looked at her with contempt now changed. At first curiosity, then disbelief, until finally they burned with respect. No more mocking laughter, no more whispers. Every glance turned to Isabella, as if waiting for the next beat of her heart to decide their fate. In a brief lull as the enemy pulled back, a sergeant rasped through smoke and grit. "We were wrong. This woman is no medic, she just saved the whole team." No reply was needed. The words seeped into every man, etched deeper than any applause they had ever known. A young corporal who had once mocked her felt himself exhale with relief when Isabella placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling retreat. That small hand, once judged too weak to carry a stretcher, now carried the weight of trust. He even forced a crooked grin through the gunfire. "If I make it out alive, I'll let you stitch a tattoo on me instead of the army doc." The clumsy joke was enough to draw a few strained chuckles, a fleeting break in the suffocating tension. But after the laughter they pulled their triggers again, because they knew Isabella had dragged them back from death's edge not just with gauze and morphine, but with skills they had never dared imagine she possessed. Sometimes, in the split-second rhythm of battle, a soldier caught Isabella's gaze. In her eyes there was no arrogance, no hunger for praise. Only the focus of someone who had known loss deeply enough to understand. Every second, every choice could mean the life of the entire team. And that alone made them bow their heads and follow without needing an official order. Recognition came in silence, yet it roared louder than any battle cry. It showed in the way a massive soldier instinctively covered her back as she dragged a wounded man to safety. It showed in the way the entire team shifted according to her pointing hand, as if they had trained with her for months. It showed in the quick nods, the locked eyes in silence and admission that the center of gravity now belonged to Isabella. In the smoke and fire, no one remembered that she had once been called a shadow. That image had burned away with the first bullets she fired. Now, before their eyes, Isabella Torres was the reason they were still standing. In a fleeting moment of quiet as the team huddled behind a boulder to reload, a young soldier shook his head, whispering to his comrade, "How blind we were, weren't we?" The other said nothing, only pressed his lips together, his eyes fixed on the small figure who still stood firm amid the haze of gunpowder. The battle was not over. The enemy had not relented. But in every heart the fear had been cut in half, because they knew they were not alone. They had someone every man now silently admitted, a leader without a rank, a living legend in their midst. The gun smoke slowly cleared, leaving Dusty Creek scarred with burn marks, the air thick with the stench of gunpowder carried by the evening wind. Dead, brittle trees stood like blackened shadows against the crimson soil, reflecting the last rays of daylight. The SEAL team regrouped behind the large boulder, each man battered and wounded, some with torn shoulders, others wrapped tightly at the waist, eyes still burning with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. They had survived, something that had seemed impossible only hours before. Isabella Torres sat quietly on a jagged rock, her hands still stained with dried blood, her medic's uniform in tatters. She wiped her fingers with a dirty scrap of cloth, her gaze fixed on the fading ridges of the Sierra Nevada mountains darkening beneath the sunset. Her face carried the fatigue of someone who had given everything, yet within it lay a strange calm, as though, at last, she had accepted both halves of herself, the one who once pulled the trigger in the shadows, and the one who chose to preserve life in the light. A young soldier, the very one who had mocked her slight frame before, stepped closer. Gently, he placed the medic bag onto her lap, his voice catching in his throat. "We owe you our lives." Isabella lifted her head, the corner of her lips curving into a faint smile. "Don't remember me as a sniper," she whispered. "Remember me as the one who kept you alive." Her words etched themselves like invisible carvings into each man, for they understood. The glory of gunfire was fleeting, but the true value lay in the fact that she had chosen to bandage, to heal even when those same hands could have ended more lives than any man among them. The Sierra Nevada sun sank completely, surrendering to a sky painted in deep violet. The final streak of red faded like the closing of an era, giving way to another beginning. In silence, the SEALs slowly realized strength was not in the stock of a rifle or the weight of a grenade, but in the choice to save comrades in the heart of hell. Word of the Dusty Creek ambush spread quickly. At first, it was only whispered within the unit that a small medic had single-handedly turned the tide. Then it spread further, into training grounds, into barracks, into mess halls where soldiers repeated it half in awe, half in doubt. And finally, it became a rumor echoing throughout the military. Isabella Torres, a medic once dismissed, was in truth the hidden legend, the long-whispered Mojave ghost. Yet for Isabella, those titles meant nothing. That day, she had not fired to prove herself, nor commanded to reclaim glory. She had done it all for one reason, only to ensure the men beside her still had the chance to go home. Deep within, she knew the past could never be undone, but today she had chosen another path. To protect, not to destroy. Night fell over Dusty Creek, the wind carrying a chill through the jagged rocks. The SEALs, bloodied and battered, walked in silence behind Isabella's figure, her medic's bag slung across her shoulder. No longer did they see her as the shadow trailing at the rear. Now each of her steps became the rhythm guiding them out of the valley of death. Perhaps for the first time in their storied careers, the most elite warriors of the United States bowed quietly behind a woman not because she was stronger than them, but because she had shown them something no weapon ever could: trust. And so, the story of Dusty Creek was not only that of a brutal ambush, it became a symbol, a place where an angel in white was forced to become a ghost to protect her brothers, only to return as a healer once more. And for those who stood with her that day, none would ever again dare to underestimate the small figure walking quietly at the rear of the formation. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.